The rain had been falling for hours, a cold, relentless downpour that turned the front steps of the Granite Falls Police Department into slick stone. Ewan Frostmoor sat on the muddy ground, his uniform torn, blood soaked into the fabric near his shoulder. His breathing was shallow, chest heaving as if each breath carried the weight of every betrayal he'd endured. Beside him, Nanuk, his loyal K9 partner, pressed close, ears back, fur-soaked, eyes fixed on the silent line of officers gathered a few feet away. Not one of them spoke. Not one stepped forward. The American flag above them hung limp in the storm, like a country that had just turned its back on its own. Only hours earlier, Ewan had been a decorated officer, respected and even feared by some. For 30 years, he'd worn the badge with pride, serving his town with unshakable loyalty. He wasn't just part of the department. He was the department. But something had shifted. Whispers started. Files went missing. Testimonies changed. Then, without warning, he was dragged into an internal investigation for a crime he didn't commit. And now, without a proper hearing, he was cast out, smeared and broken. As the officers turned their backs one by one, Ewan didn't move. His fingers trembled slightly as they rested against Nanuk's thick fur. The dog leaned into him protectively, unmoving. Nanuk had been with him through standoffs, chases, shootouts, and silence. And now, even in disgrace, the dog refused to leave his side. A few feet away, Chief Theodore Lamoureux stood with folded arms, eyes unreadable. He had once mentored Ewan, had even stood beside him at his wife's funeral. But now, he was just another uniform in the fog. Ewan's thoughts were chaotic, flashes of past missions, of moments shared with Nanuk, of voices raised in anger behind closed doors. He couldn't make sense of what had happened. How had it come to this? He had protected people like Callum de Rosier and Lucien Hargrave for years, officers who now couldn't even look him in the eye. Somewhere deep inside, though, Ewan knew, someone had wanted him gone. Someone with power. And they'd found a way. But what they hadn't expected was Nanuk. The department could take away his badge, his pension, even his name. But it couldn't take the loyalty of a dog who had seen the truth in every heartbeat, every breath. Ewan looked down at Nanuk, and for a moment, he didn't feel alone. The storm wasn't over. Not outside, and definitely not inside him. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the gray still hung heavy over Granite Falls like a silent verdict. Ewan Frostmoor stood at the edge of his small front porch, a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hand and Nanuk at his feet. The world felt quieter now, as if even the birds refused to sing after what had happened. His uniform jacket still lay crumpled on the couch inside, blood dried into the fabric. It wasn't just clothing, it was a part of who he was, or had been. And now, with a few signatures and cold stares, it was gone. Inside, the walls of Ewan's modest home were lined with framed commendations and old photographs. There was one of him shaking hands with Chief Lamoureux during a Medal of Valor ceremony, another with his former squad, Callum de Rosier, Bastian Coleridge, Rowan McKendrick, all of them younger, proud, untouched by suspicion. Ewan stared at them now with a bitter taste in his mouth. How many of them had known? How many had watched it happen and said nothing? He sat at the kitchen table, papers spread in front of him, official reports, statements, timelines. None of it made sense. The accusation had come out of nowhere. Evidence tampering in a robbery case he'd led 6 months ago. It was absurd. Ewan had always documented every step, always followed protocol. But the files had vanished. The chain of custody had been altered. And somehow, all fingers pointed to him. It was too neat. Too orchestrated. Nanuk paced the floor, sensing the shift in his partner's energy. He stopped beside Ewan, resting his head on the man's thigh. Ewan absent-mindedly stroked the dog's fur. His eyes narrowed with something colder than grief, determination. Someone inside that department had set him up. He didn't know why, but he was sure of it. And he wasn't going to just disappear quietly. If they thought stripping him of his badge would be enough to silence him, they didn't know who they were dealing with. A knock at the door made him flinch. Ewan stood slowly, peering through the curtain. It was Cormac Vaillancourt, a former detective who'd retired last year after his wife passed. He looked out of place, coat too thin for the weather, a man weighed down by something more than just age. Ewan opened the door cautiously. "Cormac?" he asked. The older man gave a nod, his voice low. "Mind if I come in? There's something you need to hear. Something I should have told you a long time ago." And just like that, the silence of disgrace cracked open. Cormac Vaillancourt sat across from Ewan at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly around a worn leather folder. His eyes were bloodshot, not just from age or fatigue, but from guilt. Ewan watched him closely, Nanuk curled under the table, occasionally glancing up, sensing the heaviness in the room. The coffee between them had gone cold, but neither man touched it. There was no small talk, no easing into what had to be said. Cormac finally exhaled and opened the folder, revealing a set of old documents, a few handwritten notes, and a single creased photograph. "I didn't know the whole plan," Cormac began, his voice gravelly. "But I knew something wasn't right. 6 months ago, I found a file in the evidence room. It was your case, the Brantley robbery. But the evidence log had 2 different dates. 2 sets of initials. One was yours. The other," he hesitated, "was Rowan McKendrick's. Only, his entry wasn't supposed to exist." Ewan leaned forward, his eyes sharp. Rowan, his former trainee, had always been ambitious, too eager. Ewan had once covered for him on a minor mistake years ago, thinking it would help him grow. Now, he wasn't so sure. Cormac continued. "I flagged it. Quietly. Asked Chief Lamoureux about it, off the record. He told me to let it go. Said it was being handled internally. A week later, I got reassigned to cold case work. No explanation." He shook his head. "I think they were already setting you up back then. Rowan's record was spotless on paper, but I always saw the cracks. You were in the way, Ewan. They needed a fall guy." Ewan's jaw tightened. The betrayal burned deeper than he expected. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" he asked, voice low. Cormac met his gaze, shame in his expression. "Because I was scared. I thought maybe it'd blow over. I told myself you'd come out clean. But when they made it official, when they stripped your badge, I knew I'd waited too long." Ewan stood and walked to the window, staring out into the gray morning. Everything inside him was shifting: anger, betrayal, sorrow, but beneath it all, a sense of purpose was rising. If Rowan and Lamoureux had framed him, they hadn't just destroyed his career. They had corrupted the very thing he'd dedicated his life to protect. Behind him, Cormac's voice broke the silence again. "There's more. I think Bastian Coldridge is involved too. And if I'm right, then this goes higher than just the department." Ewan turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "It's time to pull this whole thing into the light." Ewan Frostmoor hadn't slept. The conversation with Cormac replayed in his mind like a broken tape, every word, every pause, every piece of withheld truth. The folder Cormac had left sat on his desk now, surrounded by scribbled notes and timelines. Nanuk lay curled near the doorway, ears twitching at every creak of the house. Ewan's world, once built on loyalty and law, now felt like a minefield of deception. And he had walked straight into it blind. The name Bastian Coldridge stuck in his thoughts like a splinter. Bastian had always played the politics of the department better than anyone. Clean uniform, polished shoes, perfect handshake. But there had been rumors. Whispers about backdoor deals with city contractors, about missing narcotics reports that never made it past internal review. Ewan had ignored them, focused on his own cases. That was his mistake. He'd trusted the system more than the signs. He needed proof. Real proof. Not suspicion, not hearsay. If he was going to clear his name and expose the rot at the core of Granite Falls PD, it had to be undeniable. That meant risk. That meant breaking into the place he had once sworn to protect. Ewan stared at the floor plan of the department headquarters, the one he knew by heart. The archive room, locked after hours, might still hold the original evidence reports from the Brantley robbery, if they hadn't been destroyed. By nightfall, Ewan was dressed in dark jeans, a black jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low. Nanuk trotted behind him silently, as if sensing the mission was different this time. They parked 3 blocks away and moved through alleyways until they reached the back of the building. The same building where Ewan had once been saluted, once led raids, once gave orders. Now, he was just another shadow against the wall. The side door was still secured with the outdated keypad. Ewan hesitated only a second before entering the code, 0429. His wedding anniversary. They had never changed it. That, at least, gave him a bitter chuckle. He slipped inside with Nanuk close, navigating the dimly lit corridors like muscle memory. Every corner felt haunted, every step a reminder of who he used to be. As he reached the basement archive, Ewan froze. The door was open. That wasn't protocol. Not even during internal reviews. Nanuk growled low, his body stiffening. From within the room came the soft click of a file drawer closing, followed by footsteps. Someone was already inside. Ewan's breath caught in his throat as the footsteps grew louder. Nanuk tensed beside him, a low growl building in his chest. The two moved silently, pressing against the wall outside the archive door. Ewan's hand slid to the small flashlight in his jacket, switching it on to a dim beam. He glanced down at Nanuk, gave a silent hand signal, and then stepped into the room. Standing by the open file cabinet, flashlight in one hand and a folder in the other, was Lucien Hargrave, the department's new internal affairs liaison. Ewan hadn't expected him. Lucien turned, eyes wide for a split second before his face settled into something colder. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly, snapping the folder shut. "Neither should you," Ewan replied, stepping forward, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. Nanuk followed, teeth bared slightly, as if ready to act on instinct. Lucien didn't flinch. "You're making this worse for yourself. Walk away, Frostmoor." The nerve of it made Ewan want to laugh. "Walk away? You took everything from me. My badge. My name. You expect me to just disappear while you cover for a corrupt operation?" He moved closer, watching Lucien's grip tighten on the folder. "Tell me, does Bastien sign off on the edits, or is it Rowan who handles the dirty work?" Lucien's silence was answer enough. Ewan's pulse spiked. He had guessed right. The triangle of betrayal was more real than ever, and Lucien was the gatekeeper. "You were never supposed to get this far," Lucien muttered, his tone no longer cold, but tired. "This was supposed to be clean. No noise. No dog at your side." His eyes drifted to Nanuk, and for the first time, there was something like fear in them. Ewan stepped forward, voice low but cutting. "You're going to hand me that folder. You're going to leave this room. And you're going to pretend you never saw me. Or I take this all the way, press, Federal Review, everything." Lucien hesitated, the weight of his choices visible in the twitch of his jaw. After a moment, he slowly extended the folder. "You won't make it to court," he warned. "They'll bury this." Ewan took the folder, eyes locked on Lucien's. "Then I'll dig deeper." As Lucien turned and vanished into the corridor, Ewan exhaled. Nanuk stayed close, eyes sharp, sensing the danger wasn't over. Inside the folder, a single page marked confidential, and a signature at the bottom. Rowan McKendrick. Ewan sat in the darkness of his truck, parked behind an abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of Granite Falls. The folder lay open across the passenger seat, pages weighed down by a flashlight. Nanuk sat alert beside him, ears twitching at every passing sound. The document signed by Rowan McKendrick wasn't just damning, it was explosive. It outlined an unreported evidence transfer during the Brantley robbery case, citing departmental discretion. The signature wasn't forged. It was real. Rowan had taken evidence without protocol, then pinned it on Ewan. The page was stamped confidential, routed through an internal network that Lucien Hargrave had access to, but never logged. This wasn't negligence. It was a cover-up. Ewan felt rage pulse beneath his skin, but beneath that was something heavier: disappointment. Rowan had been like a younger brother once. Eager, brave, naive. Ewan had mentored him, defended him. Now, that loyalty had been weaponized. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through old contacts. Most had gone quiet since the scandal broke. Only one name stood out now: Theodore Lamoureux. The chief. The man who could have stopped all of this. Ewan hesitated. Would Lamoureux answer? Would he even care? Or was he part of the rot, turning a blind eye for the sake of politics? Before he could decide, headlights flashed in the rearview mirror. A black SUV had pulled into the lot behind him. Ewan's heart pounded. He reached across to snap the folder shut. Nanuk growled, teeth bared. Two men stepped out of the SUV, one tall and broad, the other shorter, hunched, wearing a ball cap low over his eyes. They didn't walk like cops. They walked like men who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. Ewan didn't wait. He grabbed the folder, opened the door, and whistled low. Nanuk leapt out beside him, hackles raised. The men paused. One of them smirked. "Evening, Officer Frostmoor," he said mockingly. "Or is it ex-officer now?" Ewan stood his ground. "You're not from the department," he said calmly. "So who sent you?" "Rowan. Bastian." The smirk faded. "You talk too much. You dig too deep. That folder doesn't belong to you." Ewan raised an eyebrow. "That so?" He tucked the folder under his jacket. "Then come take it." Nanuk snarled, and for a moment, no one moved. The tension hung like wire between them, ready to snap. The taller man took one step forward, and Nanuk lunged. The night exploded into chaos. Nanuk launched forward like a bolt of muscle and fury, teeth sinking into the taller man's forearm before he could draw the weapon at his hip. The man screamed, stumbling backward, crashing into the hood of the SUV. The shorter one rushed at Ewan, swinging a metal baton, but Ewan ducked low, years of training taking over. He drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, slamming him into the side of the truck with a hollow clang. For a moment, the world narrowed into violence and instinct. Ewan fought like a man who'd been cornered, betrayed, and buried, but never broken. Nanuk snarled beside him, circling the now wounded attacker, who cursed and crawled backward toward the vehicle. The other man, the one Ewan had tackled, groaned on the pavement. "You're making this worse," he spat through blood. Ewan grabbed the collar of his jacket. "You haven't seen worse yet," he growled, fists shaking. Ewan knew better than to linger. Whoever sent these men wouldn't stop at one warning. He grabbed Nanuk's collar and hauled him into the truck, slamming the door as tires screeched behind him. Dust kicked up around them as he sped off, hands gripping the wheel hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Nanuk whined softly, resting his head on Ewan's leg. A small gash ran along the dog's side. Ewan's stomach twisted. "I'm sorry, buddy," he whispered, voice cracking. He couldn't go home now. Not with a target on his back. Not with the folder still burning a hole through his jacket. He headed south, toward an old hunting cabin once owned by a friend of his father's, long abandoned, but still standing. It was off the grid, no cameras, No neighbors and no paper trail. He needed time. And he needed answers. As they reached the outskirts of town, Ewan's phone buzzed. A blocked number. He almost ignored it, but something in his gut told him not to. He answered, silent. A familiar voice came through, calm, composed, but unmistakably cold. "Ewan," said Rowan McKendrick. "You should have left it alone." Ewan didn't reply. He could feel his pulse thudding in his ears. Rowan continued, "I admired you once. But you're out of your depth. That file you stole, it's not just evidence. It's leverage. And the people it implicates don't forgive." Ewan finally spoke, voice low. "Then they picked the wrong man to set up." The line went dead. And the war got personal. The cabin creaked under the weight of time and silence. Dust floated through the air in faint beams of moonlight, and the smell of dry wood and old memories filled the room. Ewan sat at the edge of a broken-down sofa, cradling a damp towel against Nanuk's wound. The gash wasn't deep, but it was a reminder that the people chasing them weren't playing games anymore. Nanuk didn't flinch, only watched his partner with calm, unblinking loyalty. Ewan hadn't slept in over 24 hours. The folder now lay open on a makeshift table, a cracked wooden bench near the fireplace. More than just Rowan's signature, the file included internal memos, falsified timestamps, and communications with Bastian Coleridge and Lucian Hargrave. But there was one more name scribbled in the margins of a printed email, barely legible, circled in red ink: Theodore Lamoureux. It confirmed what Ewan had refused to believe until now. The chief wasn't just complicit, he was involved at the root. The entire operation had been about asset seizure and profit laundering through manufactured investigations. The Brantley robbery was just one example. Ewan had stumbled onto it without realizing, and instead of letting him dig deeper, they buried him. Stripped him of his badge, his reputation, everything but Nanuk. He stared into the fire, the weight of betrayal pressing against his chest. These weren't just former colleagues, they were men he had trusted with his life. He thought about the days they spent in the field together, the laughs, the close calls. Now those memories felt like rusted bullets, once useful, now dangerous if touched. Nanuk shifted beside him, placing his head on Ewan's lap. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, a sound. Tires crunching over gravel. Ewan moved quickly, grabbing the folder and sliding it into a metal case beneath the floorboards, one of the cabin's old hunting storage bins. He turned off the lamp and crouched near the window. A single car, its headlights off, rolled to a stop near the tree line. A shadow stepped out, tall, broad shoulders, moving slowly. Ewan's hand hovered over the grip of his pistol. He didn't want to shoot first, but he wasn't going down easy. A knock at the door. Not forceful, not urgent. Then a voice. "Ewan, it's Callum de Rosier. I'm not here to arrest you." That name hit like a stone. Once his closest ally. Once family. Now, he might be his last hope, or his final betrayal. Callum de Rosier stood in the doorway, drenched from the misty night air, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Ewan kept his pistol low but ready, eyes locked on the man who had once been like a brother to him. Nanuk stood between them, tense but quiet. The room crackled with more than just firewood. There was history between them. Old loyalty, buried trust, and something unspoken that had been waiting years to surface. "You shouldn't have come alone," Ewan said, voice hoarse. Callum stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind him. "If I'd come with backup, you would have run," he replied, brushing water off his jacket. "And we both know, you're tired of running." Ewan didn't answer. He gestured toward a chair. Callum sat, glancing around the dim cabin like it was a place built from Ewan's exile. "They think you're cornered. But you're closer than you've ever been. That folder? It's enough to burn down half the department." Ewan studied him. "And what are you doing here, Callum? Damage control? Or are you finally choosing a side?" Callum's eyes flickered, pain, shame, and something deeper. "I should have spoken up months ago," he admitted. "When Rowan started changing case notes. When Bastien started calling shots that didn't make sense. I knew something was off. But I told myself it wasn't my fight." "It was your fight," Ewan snapped. "You wore the badge. You swore the same oath I did. But you let them bury me." Callum didn't argue. He let the words hit him. Then he leaned forward. "I've spent weeks gathering what I could. Emails, surveillance footage, off-the-record conversations. And I've got enough to connect Lamoureux directly to the asset laundering." Ewan's jaw clenched. It was the confirmation he needed, but it came too late to undo what was already done. "Why now?" he asked. "Why not 6 months ago?" Callum met his gaze. "Because I was scared. Same as Cormac. Same as everyone who knew the truth and looked away. But seeing what they did to you, to Nanuk, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Callum reached into his coat and placed a small drive on the table. "Everything's on here. Names, dates, signatures. If we get this to the right people, it's over." Ewan stared at the drive, then at the man across from him. Callum added quietly, "They won't let this happen without a fight. You know that." Ewan nodded, standing slowly. Nanuk rose beside him. "They want a war?" Ewan said. "Let's give them one." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, lights, and murmurs of disbelief. Ewan Frostmoor stood just outside the building, the wind tugging at his jacket as Nanuk sat obediently at his side. The press had caught wind of the scandal hours earlier, but the full storm hadn't hit, yet. In Ewan's hands was a folder and a flash drive. One held the original files Rowan tried to bury. The other, Callum's evidence, the final nail in the coffin. Behind those courthouse doors waited a federal investigator, ready to listen. Inside, Callum had already begun testifying. Cormac, too. Lucian Hargrave had turned himself in that morning after hearing about the leak. Bastien Coleridge had gone radio silent. Rowan McKendrick had disappeared. But his signature on the reports was enough. Enough to unravel the house of cards they'd built, one lie at a time. The dominoes were falling, and this time, Ewan wasn't the one being crushed beneath them. Ewan's name would be cleared, but that wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was restoring what had been broken. The uniform? It could stay in the closet. The badge? It was just metal. But the truth, the one thing they tried to erase, was alive and louder than ever. For the first time in months, he stood tall, not because the fight was over, but because he had chosen to see it through. Later that night, Ewan sat alone on the back porch of the cabin, Nanuk curled beside him. The fire crackled inside, but out here, under the stars, everything was quiet. Peaceful. He thought of all he had lost, friends, time, faith. But also what he'd gained, clarity, purpose, and the quiet companionship of a dog who had never once questioned him. His phone buzzed. A message from Callum. Lamoureux just resigned. It's over. Ewan didn't smile. He simply looked at Nanuk, scratched behind his ears, and whispered, "We did it." The dog wagged his tail once and rested his head on Ewan's boot. The battle was behind them now. But the scar it left would always remain. Still, scars didn't have to define a man. Sometimes, they simply reminded him of what he'd survived. He stood, watching the moonlight dance across the trees. Somewhere in the distance, sirens echoed faintly, someone else's fight now. Ewan turned to go inside, Nanuk trotting close behind. And with the door closing softly behind them, the past finally stayed where it belonged.